When Glanton and his men rode in, they were fallen upon as saints. Women ran alongside the horses to touch their boots, and presents of every kind were pressed upon them until each man rode with an embarrassment of melons and pastries and trussed chickens gathered in the bow of his saddle. When they rode out 3 days later, the streets stood empty. Not even a dog followed them to the gates. They wandered the borderland for weeks, seeking some sign of the Apache. Deployed upon that plain, they moved in a constant elision, ordained agents of the actual, dividing out the world which they encountered, and leaving what had been and what would never be alike extinguished on the ground behind them. Spectre horsemen, pale with dust, anonymous in the crenellated heat. Above all else they appeared wholly at venture, primal, provisional, devoid of order, like beings provoked out of the absolute rock and set nameless and at no remove from their own loomings to wander ravenous and doomed and mute as Gorgons shambling the brutal wastes of Gondwana land in a time before nomenclature was and each was all. Long past dark that night, when the moon was already up, a party of women that had been upriver drying fish returned to the village and wandered howling through the ruins. A few fires still smoldering on the ground, and dogs slank off from among the corpses. An old woman knelt at the blackened stones before her door and poked brush into the coals and blew back a flame from the ashes and began to right the overturned pots. All about her the dead lay with their peeled skulls like polyps bluely wet or luminescent melons cooling on some mesa of the moon. In the days to come, the frail black rebuses of blood in those sands would crack and break and drift away, so that in the circuit of few suns all trace of the destruction of these people would be erased. The desert wind would salt their ruins, and there would be nothing, nor ghost nor scribe, to tell any pilgrim in his passing how it was that people had lived in this place and in this place died. The Americans entered the town of Carizal late in the afternoon on the second day following, their horses festooned with the reeking scalps of the Tiguas. This town had fallen almost to ruin. Many of the houses stood empty, and the Presidio was collapsing back into the earth out of which it had been raised, and the inhabitants seemed themselves made vacant by old terrors. They watched the passing of that blood-stained argosy through their streets with dark and solemn eyes. Those riders seemed journeyed from a legendary world, and they left behind a strange tainture like an afterimage on the eye, and the air they disturbed was altered and electric. They passed along the ruinous walls of the cemetery, where the dead were trestled up in niches, and the ground strewn with bones and skulls and broken pots, like some more ancient ossuary. Other ragged folk appeared in the dusty streets behind them and stood looking after. When they rode out in the morning it was still dark. Lightning stood in ragged chains far to the south, silent, the staccato mountains bespoken blue and barren out of the void. Day broke upon a smoldering reach of desert darkly clouded, where the riders could count 5 separate storms spaced upon the shores of the round earth. They were riding in pure sand, and the horses labored so hugely that the men were obliged to dismount and lead them, toiling up steep eskers where the wind blew and white pumice from the crests like the spume from sea swells, and the sand was scalloped and frailly shaped, and nothing else was there save random polished bones. They were all day among the dunes, and in the evening, coming down from the last low sand hills to the plain below, among catclaw and crucifixion thorn, they were a parched and haggard lot, man and beast. Harpy eagles flew up screaming from a dead mule, and wheeled off westward into the sun as they led the horses out onto the plain. 2 nights later they bivouacked in a pass in the mountains. They could see the distant lights of the city below. They crouched along a shale ridge in the leeward wall of the gap, while the fire sawed in the wind, and they watched the lamps winking in the blue floor of the night 30 miles away. The judge crossed before them in the dark. Sparks from the fire ran down the wind. He took his seat among the scrabbled plates of shale out there, and so they sat like beings from an older age, watching the distant lamps dim out one by one until the city on the plain had shrunk to a small core of light, that might have been a burning tree or some solitary encampment of travelers, or perhaps no ponderable fire at all. They rode west into the mountains. They passed through small villages, doffing their hats to folk whom they would murder before the month was out. Mud pueblos that lay like plague towns, with the crops rotting in the fields, and what stock not driven off by the Indians, wandering at will, and none to herd or tend it, and many villages almost wholly depopulated of male inhabitants, where the women and children crouched in terror in their hovels, listening until the last hoof-clop died in the distance. At the town in Akori there was a cantina, and here the company dismounted and crowded through the doorway and took tables. Tobin volunteered to guard the horses. He stood watching up and down the street. No one paid him any mind. These people had seen Americans in plenty, dusty, laggard trains of them, months out of their own country and half crazed with the enormity of their own presence in that immense and blood-slaked waste, commandeering meal and meat or indulging a latent taste for rape among the slow-eyed girls of that country. The next town they entered was 2 days deeper into the Sierras. They never knew what it was called. A collection of mud huts pitched on the naked plateau. As they rode in, the people ran before them like harried game. Their cries to one another, or perhaps the visible frailty of them, seemed to incite something in Glanton. Brown watched him. He nudged forth his horse and drew his pistol, and this somnolent pueblo was forthwith dragooned into a weltering shambles. Many of the people had been running toward the church, where they knelt clutching the altar, and from this refuge they were dragged howling one by one, and one by one they were slain and scalped in the chancel floor. When the riders passed through this same village 4 days later, the dead were still in the streets, and buzzards and pigs were feeding on them. The scavengers watched in silence while the company picked their way past like supernumeraries in a dream. When the last of them was gone, they commenced to feed again. They entered the city haggard and filthy and reeking with the blood of the citizenry for whose protection they had contracted. The scalps of the slain villagers were strung from the windows of the governor's house, and the partisans were paid out of the all but exhausted coffers, and the Sociedad was disbanded and the bounty rescinded. Within a week of their quitting the city, there would be a price of 8,000 pesos posted for Glanton's head. They rode out on the north road, as would parties bound for El Paso, but before they were even quite out of sight of the city, they had turned their tragic mounts to the west, and they rode infatuate and half fond toward the red demise of that day, toward the evening lands and the distant pandemonium of the sun.